Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome in every possible sense to Southwark Cathedral this evening for this very important talk by Emily Kenway. As some of you will know, the Cathedral's social justice programme this year is focusing on the subject of modern slavery. And when we were thinking through this year's programme, reading Emily's book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, which you'll be able to buy on your way out, and the title of tonight's talk, reading it was as essential to our thinking and our shaping of the programme as it was insightful about ulterior motives and weaponization and motivating for exposure and change. Emily, of course, is a former advisor to the UK's first anti-slavery commissioner. Those of you who know Emily's work will know that she researches, writes, and speaks about many social issues, drawing on over a decade-long career working in social justice, from campaigning for living wages to tackling worker exploitation. She's very skilled in shedding light on the crucial forces that shape our lives and communities. Her writing, of course, has been published by The Guardian, Independent, Huffington Post, TLS, and many, many more. She's currently, actually just completed and handed in 2 weeks ago, I think, a doctorate in social policy at the University of Edinburgh, and we wish you very well for your viva. Tonight, however, she is here for us to learn, to think through the truth about modern slavery. Would you please welcome Emily Kenway?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. I hope you can hear me over the fan at the back. I feel like the fan's essential, probably more essential than me in this temperature, but if it's not doable, wave at me or Emily, who also Emily at the back, and we'll do something. And, we weren't sure if people would come this evening because of the weather, so thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to talk about this evening might not be what you expect. Depends if you've come across any of my work or not. There is a kind of conventional modern slavery talk that happens, which is valid and important, and which explains the ins and outs of the definitions and the survivors' experiences. We will touch on that, but I'm going to go under the hood of that this evening and show you how that's working through a more political lens. So we'll be exploring some key questions. What is modern slavery? Just briefly. What is the modern slavery story, and what on earth do I mean by that? How does that story work? What does it mask? And what does that mean going forward? So that's what we're going to be thinking about this evening. Before I get into that, I was very kindly introduced. I'm just going to explain why I get to be standing here. There may well be other people in the room with lots of expertise on this topic, people who are survivors, people who work on this in lots of different ways, and I look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A. This is why I'm here right now. So I was a policy advisor to the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. That is a role that's appointed by government after the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 to be independent of government and scrutinise their actions. I also was a trustee for many years of a migrant domestic worker charity where there is a lot of exploitation in that sector. And so I spent a lot of time understanding the ins and outs of that. In terms of interventions and research projects, whilst at the Commissioner's office, I ran a survey of English police forces to find out what they were discovering when they went into hand car washes to do well-being checks and see whether exploitation was going on there. And I'll come back to that later. I also did a project with a colleague doing freedom of information requests to police forces around the UK, asking them about raids on sex sector properties, which had been described by police or the media as rescuing sex slaves, asking them how many people actually went into support from those raids. More recently, I've completed a study with people experiencing homelessness around Edinburgh. That's my PhD, finding out ways exploitation is manifesting there and who is more vulnerable to it, which has been memorable to say the least. And I will come back to that as well. And I've also been working with sex worker-led projects across Europe, finding out how sex workers themselves tackle exploitation in their sector rather than external charities. And finally, of course, the book. So quite a wide range there, I'd say. So what is modern slavery? This is going to be a nutshell tour of what we mean when we say this topic, because that's not really what we're interested in this evening. The simplest thing to understand is that modern slavery is severe exploitation. You will often hear me say exploitation as shorthand. There are a lot of people that dislike the word slavery being applied in the modern day for various reasons. Feel free to ask me about that. But essentially, it's because legal ownership of another person is obviously no longer allowed. And people feel that it's an erasure of white perpetrated systems of oppression historically. So that's one of the reasons people sometimes don't use it. And I'll tend to say exploitation. A really important caveat here, though, you might be familiar with economic approaches like Marxism that views all waged work as exploitation, right? So that is what that doctrine asserts. This is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about all of your jobs. We're talking about other conditions on top of that, right? So there are various indicators that I would be looking for to assess whether something is or is not exploitative. Things to do with coercion, deception, with hours, with pay, with threats, intimidation, debt, and so on, right? There's a kind of set of things you're looking for. It's an umbrella term for more specific circumstances, which each have their own definitions. So human trafficking is its own thing under the umbrella of modern slavery or exploitation. Massively misunderstood human trafficking, because most people on the street, if you go up to them, will think it requires border crossing. It's about moving countries. It's not. It only requires someone to have been recruited or transported via means which are deceptive, coercive, harmful in some way to be exploited. And that can be from here to Lewisham. It does not need you to cross borders at all. So that's one major misunderstanding that happens. Forced labor and domestic servitude, these other terms, but the basic thing is these are all severely exploitative circumstances, which we're talking about as a collection when we say the phrase modern slavery or severe exploitation, okay? And it can happen in all types of sectors, actually. One of the most interesting things about this topic is the sectors where no one ever mentions it. I don't know if people are familiar with some of the internship conditions at investment banks, for example. It's quite interesting when you work on this topic and you look at those compared to hand car washes. You're like, doesn't seem like all that much of a difference sometimes. But generally, of course, we're talking about sectors where what I like to say is people are rights deprived. They're deprived of rights in some way or ways. So that might be because the sector they're in is illegal or semi-illegal. So they don't have any labor rights. They can't go to the police if something goes wrong, right? So an illegal sector would be drug running. A lot of the people I've just worked with in my PhD take heroin to users in exploitative circumstances. So that's one of those. Or stealing, being forced to steal. Semi-illegal sex work in the UK is semi-illegal because it's actually legal to sell sex, but most things around it are criminalized. So it's like a bit of a gray area. And poorly paid, under-regulated sectors. So construction, cleaning, services, hospitality, these kinds of spaces. And you may notice that those are also sectors that tend to have high prevalence of migrant workers who often have fewer rights. Some, if they're undocumented, they are not allowed to work. So they will be very worried about raising concerns to anyone if they're being underpaid. And indeed, somewhere I used to work, we did find evidence people were deliberately employing those workers because they knew they couldn't complain about being underpaid. So you're looking at these kinds of spaces in our society, in our economy. Fundamentally, exploitation is a profit-driven activity. Someone is trying to make a profit. They're trying to get a benefit from it. That's the simplest thing to understand, and that will recur this evening. And then just a stat to give you a feel, but we might see that this isn't necessarily what it seems. In 2024, there were 19,000 possible victims of modern slavery identified in the UK. It says possible because our system works where that person is identified, they're referred for help, and then through that referral, they're assessed as to whether they are officially a victim or not. So those are just the people that went into that system. It can take a really long time to get that decision, and there are some interesting biases in who gets that decision as well. And the top 3 nationalities in 2024 were UK, Vietnamese, and Albanian, and that's actually been fairly steady for quite a while. And it might surprise you that British is at the top there, because again, usually if that surprises you, it's because you thought human trafficking was only about people coming from abroad. So that's what modern slavery is. But I've said to you, that's not really what we're going to talk about, because what we're going to talk about is the modern slavery story. And this became very apparent to me when I was working in my previous roles, including, trekking in and out of political spaces on a regular basis and realizing how this idea was being deployed. Now, there are 2 lenses with which we could think about modern slavery, and I want to be really clear that looking through one lens does not delegitimize the other lens. So there's the lens where we're looking at the experiences of victims and survivors. So the people I just spent my PhD working with on the streets of Edinburgh, their experiences are real and valid, and they should be listened to 100%. They need support. They need everything that we can imagine. But there's a second lens, which is the story that is being told about those experiences at a political and cultural level. And those do not look very similar sometimes. And it's this latter lens we're looking at, whilst, of course, recognizing the first lens is also valid, right? Now, what do I mean by this? I'm going to read you a little bit from the introduction of the book, which sets up where we're going. And you will recognize a little bit of it from this quote there that's just on the screen. Okay. There are more slaves in the world now than ever before, or at least that's what we're told. A former British Prime Minister called modern slavery the greatest human rights issue of our time. The US President described it as an outrage, and the Pope has spoken out against this crime against humanity. Business leaders are signing pledges, joining anti-slavery coalitions, and hiring investigators to root it out of their supply chains. Celebrities aren't to be left out. From Emma Thompson to Princess Eugenie, everyone's trying to fight modern slavery. We are under siege, it seems, from a new and horrific phenomenon against which the great and the good are fighting heroically. We, the public, can participate too, through marches, petitions, donations, shopping habits, and apps. But is this really what it seems? Modern slavery is an overcrowded house, jammed to the roof with different types of experiences and circumstances. Rather than interrogating the meanings of those, the terrain we're covering is different. We're exploring the application of modern slavery to the world, understanding it as a frame. According to the influential American cognitive linguist George Lakoff, frames are mental structures that shape the way we see the world. You can't see or hear frames. They're part of what cognitive scientists call the cognitive unconscious. They're structures in our brains that we cannot consciously access, but we know them by their consequences, the way we reason and what counts as common sense. In this way, words aren't just words. They're like a fly landing on a spider's web. They set off a chain reaction of vibrations, impulses, rationales, decisions, and actions that determine what happens next. They tell us how we should connect different pieces of information, what's right and wrong, and as a result, what makes sense as a solution. So you will be familiar with lots of political frames. If you've heard about people on benefits described as scroungers, it's a word and it's a frame because it's telling you a lot of things you should think about being on benefits, right? That's why political language is deployed in the way it is. Another famous one is the bedroom tax, right? If people remember that attempted policy, it got reframed as a bedroom tax, which sounds absurd and completely unacceptable, and then it went, right? So this is how politics works. Things which are real experiences get talked about in particular ways, designed to trigger particular responses. And this is no different for modern slavery, even if it feels surprising to think about it in this way. Before I show you how this works, how have we got here? So the phrase modern slavery was popularized kind of 2000s, 2010s, basically. And it was because of the really important work of lots of campaigners. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of concern from Western Europe about migration from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Some of that obviously being highly problematic and xenophobic. Some of it also being concerned about women being trafficked into the sex industry in the West, which was probably exaggerated as a problem, but also did happen, right? And there were lots of brilliant campaigners, activists trying to get governments to take notice of this. And one of the ways they did it was to find compelling language. If you try and pitch an article to the media about exploitation or, maltreatment, they probably won't say yes. But if you say modern slavery, yeah, ITV is going to do a documentary about it, right? It's a sensationalist term. That is how the media works. And that works for campaigning. The living wage, as the introduction said, I used to work on the living wage campaign. You don't forget that phrase, right? And you know what it means straight away. So this is how it works. And they did amazing work. But despite their work, and despite the EU putting pressure on member states to introduce new laws on this, our UK government still refused. It refused for years under immense pressure until 2013. And that's because, as I show in the book, there was something very specific happening in British politics in 2013. The UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage's previous vehicle, was growing in popularity, and it was doing that on anti-migrant grounds. And at that time, we had a coalition government. There are some people here who I think are too young to know this. So, horrifyingly, we had a coalition government of Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. And the Conservatives were concerned about their future electoral prospects, right? Because UKIP is taking some of their base. It's taking the anti-migrant base from them. So the Conservatives in that coalition did something called Operation Wacken. Does anyone know what that is? You might know it by another phrase, the go home vans. Right, so these were vans that went round East London with billboards saying go home to migrants and a phone number telling their migrants to call it to arrange their own deportation. Government sanctioned, which, I mean, even as I say it, I've got chills. I can't believe that was done, and it was. It was actually done in 2 waves as well. However, this backfired. This was far too far for lots of Conservative voters. There are different types of voters for any party. This worked for the UKIP types, and it did not work for the Conservatives who view themselves as compassionate and kind of inclusive. It also made the Liberal Democrats very angry because they hadn't been told about this in advance, which is, fairly shocking. And then comes the idea of modern slavery. Finally, it finds an entry point into British politics, because what modern slavery does is provide a way for the government to say, we're going to be really tough, harsh on migration, like the UKIP-esque people want. But when it comes to people who've been abused and exploited, we're going to do the right thing. And you see this in a speech from Theresa May, who was the Home Secretary then at their autumn conference that year. She does a whole spiel that we are all far too familiar with now about migration, about migrants, and then she ends announcing a new modern slavery bill. And she says, you can only trust the Conservatives to be fair. And it becomes this counterweight showing, but we're fair when it's appropriate. When they're good migrants who've been trafficked, we will look after them. And that is how the modern slavery story, as we know it now, really began in the UK. That bill became the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. This moral foil is really obvious once you put on those glasses, and infuriating, which is why I wrote the book. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples that I think really show it very clearly. Now, the first example, you may remember this happening, the first incident in this passage happening. but you may not be aware of the second incident. On the morning of 23rd of October 2019, news broke that a lorry containing 39 dead people had been found at Waterglade Industrial Park in Grays, Essex. The BBC started an online live feed of the incident as it unfolded. Aerial shots showed a large white container lorry with a red driver's cap, the door still open. Dark green privacy screens protected the dignity of the dead while crime scene officers moved around in white overalls. Swiftly, journalists and producers from major news outlets began calling me for comments. At first, I wasn't sure why they were calling me, an advisor on human trafficking and exploitation, rather than someone who worked on migration issues. After all, as we know, human trafficking requires exploitation. It's not just about movement, however horrific the conditions. Without evidence of exploitation or its intent, which was unlikely to have been gathered so quickly, there was no way anyone could know that this was a trafficking case. At this stage, they didn't even know the victim's nationality. It was reported for the first day or so that they were Chinese, but they would later turn out to be Vietnamese. Then I realized what was happening. The media were taking their lead from politicians. The Member of Parliament for the constituency in which the incident occurred tweeted at 10:07 a.m. saying, "Sickening news of 39 people found dead in a container in Grays. People trafficking is a vile and dangerous business." 3 hours later, Home Secretary Priti Patel made a statement to the House of Commons in which she described the incident as tragic and truly shocking, continuing by saying that law enforcement agencies, quote, work tirelessly to secure our borders against a wide range of threats, including people trafficking. Note that she didn't actually say that it was a case of trafficking. She's cleverer than that. She alluded to it, lodging it in our minds that this was an incident to file under that category and feeding journalists the frame through which to report the tragedy. After Patel made her statement, parliamentarians responded with speeches and questions. Trafficking recurred throughout. Given that none of them knew whether this was trafficking or not, why were they so quick to ascribe it to the incident? And how come? A month after the Grays tragedy, 10 men were found struggling to breathe in the back of a lorry, again in Essex. But these men were labelled suspected migrants in the press and were all arrested on the spot on suspicion of immigration offences. At the moment of being found and reported by the media, the only difference between these 10 people and the 39 at Grays was life and death. Yet the former were considered criminals and the latter were given warm speeches about tragedy and shock. Why? And you can really see, right, in that example, the reason why is because the 39 people had died. If they had survived, they would have been arrested. They would have been put in immigration detention centres as suspected migrants, which, by the way, is another frame. What on earth is that phrase, right? You're suspected of a crime, suspected migrants, right? So that's how the modern slavery story is operating at a political level. It enabled Priti Patel, in charge of our immigration policy, to make terribly sad speeches about this horrific tragedy without having to recognise the culpability of her own immigration policies, which force people to get into lorries to come to the UK in the first place, right? And that's the only difference between those two incidents, 1 month apart in the same part of the UK. Another area where you might notice this is in labour that happens in prisons and immigration detention centres, which is never discussed as exploitation, as modern slavery. These words are not used for it, right? Because it's state sanctioned, essentially. But how interesting that in 2018, some people held in immigration detention lodged a complaint with the Home Office on the grounds of slave labour. They were working in the detention centre for £1 an hour. This is normal. And they said, this is slave labour, this is unfair. And the Home Office denied the complaint on the grounds that that work was voluntary. It was voluntary if you think that it's okay, that they had to do that work to get enough food. They get food and they get some toiletries, but they were hungry unless they did the extra work to pay the extra money to get snacks and additional nutritious food. It's also voluntary if you're okay with the fact that the labor they were doing is not what you might think. When I first was reading about this incident, I found it through my research for the book. I was imagining they were making bags or something nonsense from a TV drama, I suppose I've seen, right? They weren't at all. They were cleaning the kitchen, they were making the food, they were sorting the bathrooms out, they were doing all the labor that makes the immigration centre allowed to be open and function. If the private companies that run immigration centres in the UK were not allowed to employ them on £1 an hour, they'd be employing some of us on the minimum wage or above, so their profits would go down. That's the reality, but they do not count in statistics about modern slavery because it's been taken from the experiences and ported into a political story that's used in very specific ways. You can probably see why I wrote a book as I came to understand all these things and understand that probably lots of you here are here because you do care. And then you start to see these things and you think, my God, what is going on? So I'm going to talk you through a handful of examples that might be familiar with you and show you a bit more of how this works. Hand car washes are what they sound like. People get their cars washed by hand. And they are really well recognized as a kind of hotspot of exploitation. There is actually a slightly complicated reason for that. Essentially, if you run awareness-raising campaigns about a sector, more members of the public will call in and say they've spotted exploitation in the sector. The media will then report that there's a lot of exploitation in the sector. Then more members of the public will call in and say there's exploitation in the sector. So there are questions sometimes to ask about what we're told in this regard. But for sure, I know from my research that I mentioned earlier, you can probably guarantee that the vast majority of hand car washes, people are not being paid what they legally should be, right? They're being paid like 40 quid a day, maybe, for 10 hours. It's not the minimum wage, whatever's going on. A lot of the time, they won't have personal protective equipment and they're spraying a lot of chemicals. They might be working hours that aren't allowed, not having breaks. Sometimes they're living on site in bad accommodation. So there are a lot of problems. And the story that we're told as people who care about justice is spot the signs. You might be familiar with that phrase. Spot the signs of the modern slaves. There's even an app. There's a helpline. There's an app. And then they can be rescued. And the reality for the people in the research I did is that that's their best job option. Are you rescuing them to then put them in a training program to be a lawyer? No, right? Like that's the reality. And that's what I care about. I care about like actual change and justice, not feeling good for a moment. Another sector that is often talked about in the same breath as hand car washes is nail bars. And this very short little bit is actually why I did the book proposal after watching this documentary. So in 2018, the BBC ran a documentary about a UK modern slavery case involving Vietnamese girls working in nail bars. It's clear in the documentary that the girls had been exploited and that what had happened to them was both illegal and not in line with our social expectations of treatment of young people. But at one point in the film, one of the girls, whose name is 10, said that the woman later found guilty of exploiting her had given her clothes, shelter, and food, and that she was happy there for the first time. One of the other girls also said she was happy with the situation as she had no family or other way of supporting herself. She then began to cry and said she was afraid and that she wanted to learn English and have a good foster family. The BBC's media centre description of the show says, "The girls found in the nail bars do not see themselves as victims. As illegal immigrants with no other options, they're happy to be fed and housed and to work for free." When confronted with testimonies like these, many people reach for the idea of false consciousness. The girls don't realise they've been exploited. But maybe they do. And maybe the truly problematic fact is that it's the best option available. And this is what you see again and again when you work on this topic, is that actually a lot of the time people in the bits of the economy that maybe all of us here are fortunate enough not to be in don't have other forms of options. And that's the real problem. Yes, the boss. I've just worked with someone who's been horribly exploited in like where they do car mechanics. I don't drive. I don't know if you can tell this from some of my explanations. And yes, that boss is obviously a problem, a criminal, ought to be held to account, and he does not have any better options. There isn't that available to him. Even if he gets supported for a while by government, he will be spat out the other side into the same situation. As I say, I've recently spent a lot of time working with people experiencing homelessness, not all of whom have experienced exploitation, but some have in various sectors. And again, the story is, spot the signs, they can be rescued. And for that population that I've been working with, who are mainly British people experiencing homelessness, poor labour is the best available option. And when I say poor labour, I don't mean legal labour for them. I mean, a lot of them haven't finished school, don't really know when they left school, but it was sometime when they were a kid, reading ages are low, they've had horrific lives. There's no way for them into the jobs market, no matter what employability seminar they're forced to go to. And of course, there is major problems with addiction and related to that always mental ill health. You might know that in the UK, we've been cutting and cutting and cutting addiction and mental health services. For me, I look at this as, what's the system doing to people versus what's this comfortable story that we're being told as individuals who want to make the world better. And actually, The Truth About Modern Slavery was my publisher's title for the book. And I do love it, although it does sound a bit egotistical. I'll tell you the truth. But my original title was Slaves to the System for this reason, right? Because vulnerability makes people be exploited, and vulnerability is constructed. If I walk up to most of you in the room, maybe all of you, and say, I've got a job for you, it'll pay you 30 quid a day and I'll take you there tomorrow. What are you going to say? You're going to say no, because you have other means, you don't have addictions you're trying to feed, et cetera, right? So we have to look at these underlying factors. The last area is supply chains. So supply chains just means the ways in which all the things you consume get made. And nowadays in globalization, they stretch all across the world. And this used to be what I worked on a lot for a number of years. There is so much energy going into trying to tackle exploitation, let's say, in supply chains. It's a thriving industry of people taking lovely salaries for consulting on it, for running audits to spot possible signs of exploitation. There are companies doing some really interesting, innovative, cool stuff as well. There are some examples in the book, but it is also its own industry now, right? Like, people are making a very nice living doing this. And the story in the private sector is businesses need to train on-site staff, or tell their suppliers to train the factory managers to spot the signs. They need to make sure they're not working with rogue agencies that are going to put exploited agency workers into their supply chains. And they need to pay lots of money for people to audit their businesses, to look for these problems. That's kind of how it works. Hilariously, there are now auditors of auditors as well, which I just consistently find absolutely amazing. A friend of mine used to do that job, and she has a lot to say about that industry, let's put it that way. The reality is, supply chains are not fine unless there's one rogue person infiltrating it, causing modern slavery. Supply chains are the condition that creates the modern slavery. Because supply chains are the way they've extended globally into countries where there are very few labor rights, where sometimes unions are banned, illegal, where there is a huge pressure on the cost that you need to produce things for the big corporates at the top. So the whole supply chain regime is designed to try to keep costs as low as possible, low down, to make as much profit as possible at the top, right? And some of the stuff here is quite shocking when you look into it, if you're not familiar with this. There's a really wonderful academic called Professor Genevieve LeBaron, who's done quite a lot of academic work on this. And she makes the point that what supply chains do, they're huge now, right? They're very long. They're more like webs. And if you did like a flow chart of a supply chain of like, I'm not going to say brand names, but supermarkets or wherever you shop or wherever your toothpaste is from or whatever, you would just see like so many different suppliers branching off. And she says there's a reason for that, and it's because it creates legal distance. So if there's exploitation down there, well, we didn't know. And we did our audit, and we audited the audit. So we didn't know. And that is what happens. You can see it in court cases. We also have seen since the 70s, actually, a progressive hostility towards regulation of businesses. It's like bad to have regulation. We have this narrative in the US, UK, etc. Red tape challenge, people who were around then, government being like, oh, regulation's bad. And what that means is taking away protections workers have, taking away the things that make companies behave in certain ways that are better. The World Bank publishes this thing periodically called Doing Business, like a big chunky report about kind of the state of economies and business around the world and like where's good to site your supply chain now. And they rate countries partly on whether there's low regulation, on whether there isn't too much worker organizing for their rights. That is how the capitalist system is working right now in advanced capitalism. When you work in this space, you consistently see, so much money pouring into this kind of bad apple narrative of like, let's just make sure that that person doesn't infiltrate that farm, that then that doesn't mean that on the supermarket shelves, people can say it's slave-produced food, rather than looking at this whole structural thing, which is really what's producing it. So I've talked about regulation. I did want to highlight another thing here, and I promise this is going to be very interesting in a minute. Inspection of workplaces is quite important because it's one of the ways that we make sure employers are adhering to our rights, right? The minimum wage, all of these things, right? It's especially important when you know that the people least likely to complain about their worker treatment, like if they're not being paid the minimum wage or holiday pay or sick pay, the people least likely to complain are the poorest paid, right? Like everyone who's a consultant at wherever is complaining, and the cleaner of that consultancy is not complaining. So it's really important to have inspections of places from a justice perspective. So the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate is what it sounds like. It inspects employment agencies. In 2019, I'm about to ask you a question, so listen. In 2019, its remit was 18,000 agencies and 1.1 million workers. How many staff do you think the Employment Agency Standard Inspectorate had? I've never done an interactive moment in a talk before, so don't leave me hanging. 18,000 agencies, 1.1 million staff. Shout numbers out and I'll repeat it so everyone. Lots of guesses, ranging from 5 to 22. Okay, 13 for 18,000 agencies. For the average business, how frequently can they expect a visit from HMRC's wage unit, which inspects whether people are being paid the minimum wage or not? Once every what? 4 years, 5 years? 112? Someone knows the answer. 500 years. I'm serious. But it's fine, because if there's a baddie, we'll find him. Right? And this is the reality. This is the conditions that are going on. And what I think is, far more important. The reality is the way exploitation works, you need to think about it on a continuum with other labor. You've got really awful situations here and brilliant situations here and loads of gradations in between those two poles. The more you create situations where harm can be caused because of supply chain practices, inspection, regulation, like hostility towards unions, immigration policies that criminalize people, the more you create that, the more abuse you have in the middle of the continuum and the more you have knocking onto the end with the really sharp end. They're not separate. And one of the things the modern slavery story does is tell you it's separate. It's a criminal issue. It's for police, right? But actually, all of these things overlap. It's systemic. So in a nutshell, we have this kind of modern slavery fairy tale, right? That is comforting. I talk in the book, like, we like fairy tales for a reason. And I understand that. It's comforting. It has a clear individual villain or gang of villains. They like to talk about gangs. Actually, research shows that's not normally correct. But it's a baddie. Often they're racialized, they're foreign, they're a foreign gang. Certainly, they're not kind of the same ilk as the politicians and police and media talking about it. So we've got this clear baddie who we can feel good about catching. And we've got this innocent victim. You know, you see in that awful incident from Grays where the 39 people died, the reality of those 39 people, because people then went and investigated, journalists went to Vietnam and found out about those people and gave them their names back and told people who they were. They were trying to migrate to the UK for a better life. So technically what they were doing was illegal because it's migrant smuggling, right? You're not allowed to cross a border without the right paperwork. I do not agree with that. That's the government's approach. So, but they were cast as the innocent victim because they died. You can't stand up in Parliament and say it's fine they've died because actually this is what our policies do. There's rescue and there's happily ever after, which I wish was the case. It's talked about as this aberration. You know, I've said the phrase bad apple, rogue, infiltrated. You will start to notice this language everywhere on this topic. And that's the whole idea. It's like, it's a shock. You know, it's this strange incident that has appeared from nowhere because of a baddie. And it's kind of occasional and very sensational, right? You get, if you analyze media coverage of this, you get certain kinds of pictures that recur. Or we have a reality, which is that systems and policies make people vulnerable to me coming up to them and saying, I've got a job for you for 30 quid, and that being the beginning of a process of exploitation. Sometimes those systems and policies directly exploit people, like the example from immigration detention. We also have victims who are humans, like everyone else, who have complex lives and needs, who have consent that is constrained in various ways and limited options. And that's why the book dedication is for all those who deserve better options. From rescue, we might think about extraction. People do need to be extracted sometimes. There is absolutely no doubt about that, of course. But the reality is they're returned to those systems and policies. In fact, we deport quite a lot of people officially recognized as victims of modern slavery once they've had some limited, poorly paid support from us. We deport them back to the country of origin if they were from a different country. Sometimes to different ends of that country in case the people who traffic them find them. It's not an aberration, is it, from what I've said? It seems kind of predictable, certainly from those inspection statistics, right? And I would suggest it's endemic and mundane. And by mundane there, I mean it's every day, you know, and certainly from my research, you know, I know Edinburgh in a very different way now, having done my PhD research there and looked at exploitation in the homeless community there. And it is every day. I'm walking past people every day and I understand the exploitative labour that is the norm. It's how people get by. What does this mean then? Right? Because this is maybe a different way of thinking about this than we might be comfortable with. So I'm going to read you the very end of the book and really where I hope this puts us as a leaping off point. Nothing exists in isolation. The modern slavery story tells us that exploitation is something separate to the whole, but of course it isn't. Exploitation of the kinds described are products of our political economy. They do not spring from thin air, but are manifestations of the underlying system. We need to take responsibility for the whole. We who are so fortunate as to avoid poor work and harsh choices in order to survive and improve our lives need to listen to those who have no such good options. We need to hear what they have to say about why that's the case and what they think should be changed. Then we must act to redistribute power and value in our society, pulling up by the roots the causes of harm and planting decency and equity in their place. In doing so, we lose our fairy tales, but we gain a better reality. Thank you.